Chapter 166, The Thames Pirates. Moored at a wharf at the Rotherhithe side of the River Thames, nearly opposite Execution Dock, were several lighters and barges all lying together. Along the upper part of the buildings belonging to the wharf were painted in rude but gigantic letters the following words: Mossop's Wharf, where goods are received, housed, or carted. Mr. Mossop, the sole proprietor of this wharf, was by no means particular what goods he thus received, whence they came, and when he housed them, or whither they were going when he carted them. He asked no questions, so long as his commission and charges were duly paid. For the convenience of his numerous customers, he kept his office constantly open, and either himself or his son, Ben Mossop, were in constant attendance. Indeed, Mr. Mossop did more business by night than by day. He was, however, a close man. He never put impertinent questions to anyone who called to patronize him, and thus his way of doing business was vastly convenient for all those who used his wharf or his storehouses. If a lighter arrived at that wharf, ostensibly with a freight of hay, but in reality with divers bales of cotton or other goods concealed beneath the dried grass, Mr. Mossop did not seem to think that there was anything at all strange in this. And if the next day he happened to hear that a barge at a neighboring wharf had been robbed of divers bales of cotton during the night, Mr. Mossop was too much of a gentleman to question the integrity of his customers. Even if every wall in Rotherhithe, Marsleighdown, and Bermondsey were covered with placards announcing the loss of the bales, describing them to a nicety, and offering a reward for their recovery, Mr. Mossop never stopped to read one of them. On 2 or 3 occasions, when a police officer called at his wharf and politely requested him just to honor the nearest magistrate with a visit and enter into an explanation how certain goods happened to be found in his storerooms, the said goods having been lost by other parties in an unpleasant manner, Mr. Mossop would put an enormous pair of spectacles upon his nose and a good face on the matter at the same time, and it invariably happened that he managed to convince the bench of his integrity, but without in any way compromising those persons who might be in custody on account of the said goods. His son Ben was equally prudent and reserved, and thus father and son were mighty favorites with all the river pirates who patronized them. Moreover, Mossop's Wharf was most conveniently situated. The front looked, of course, upon the river, the back open in Rotherhithe Wall, and Mossop's carts were noted for the celerity with which they would convey goods away from the warehouse to the receivers in Blue Anchor Road or in the neighborhood of Halfpenny Hatch. The father and son were also famous for the regularity and dispatch with which they executed business on pressing occasions. Thus, while Mossop Sr. would superintend the landing of goods upon the wharf, Mossop Jr. was stationed at the back gate, where it was his pleasing duty to see the bales speedily carted as they were brought through the warehouse by the lumpers employed. Mossop Sr. was also reputed to be a humane man, for if any of his best customers got into trouble, which was sometimes the case, and were short of funds, a £5 note in a bank envelope would reach them in prison to enable them to employ counsel in their defense, and this sum invariably appeared as money lent in Mossop's next account against them when they were free once more, and enabled to land another cargo at the wharf. But to continue our narrative. It was the evening after the one on which Morcar had called at Markham Place, consequently the evening of that day when he was to meet our hero in the Tower Wharf. Over the particulars of that meeting we, however, pass, as the plans then arranged will presently develop themselves. It was now about 9 o'clock. The evening was beautiful and moonlit. Myriads of stars were rocked to and fro in the cradle of the river's restless tide, and the profiles of the banks were marked with thousands of lights dancing through dense forests of masts belonging to the shipping that were crowded along those shores. At intervals, those subdued murmurs, which denoted that the river was as busy and active as the great city itself, were absorbed in the noise of some steamer ploughing its rapid way amidst the mazes of vessels that to the inexperienced eye appeared to be inextricably entangled together. Then would arise those shouts of warning to the smaller craft, those rapid commands to regulate the movements of the engines, and those orders to the helmsman which, emanating from the lips of the captain posted on the paddle box, proclaimed the progress of the steamer winding its way up the pool. A wondrous and deeply interesting spectacle, though only dimly seen, is that portion of the Thames on a moonlit night. Then indeed is it that even the most callous mind is compelled to contemplate with mingled astonishment and awe one of the grandest features of the sovereign city and world's emporium of trade. The gurgling water and the countless masts, the vibration of mighty engines on the stream, and the myriads of twinkling lights along the shores, the cheering voices of the mariners, and the dense volumes of smoke which moving colossal chimneys vomit forth, the metallic grating of windlasses and the glittering of the spray beneath the revolving wheels, the flapping of heavy canvas and the glare from the oval windows of steamers, the cries of the rowers in endangered boats, and the flood of silver luster which the moon pours upon the river's bosom. These form a wondrous complication of elements of interest for both ear and eye. The barge that was farthest off from Mossop's wharf of all the lighters moored there, and that could consequently get into the steam quicker than any other near it, was one to which we must particularly direct our readers' attention. It was called the Ferry, and was large, decently painted, and kept in pretty good order. It had a spacious cabin, and a smaller one termed a cuddy forward. The mast, with its large brown sail that seemed as if it had been tanned, was so fitted as to be lowered at pleasure to enable the vessel to pass under the bridges at high water. The rudder was of enormous size, and the tiller was as thick and long as the pole of a carriage. The waist, or uncovered part of the lighter in the middle, was now empty, and it was very capacious and adapted to contain an immense quantity of goods. On the evening in question, 2 men were sitting on the windlass, smoking their pipes and pretty frequently applying themselves to a can of grog which stood upon the deck near them. One was the Resurrection Man. The other was John Wicks, better known as the Buffer. "Well, Jack," said the Resurrection Man, "this is precious slow work. For the last 4 days we've done nothing." "What did I tell you when you first come to me and proposed to take to the river?" exclaimed the Buffer. "Didn't I say that one ought to be bred to the business to do much good in it?" "Oh, that be hanged," cried the Resurrection Man. "I can soon learn any business that's to make money. Besides, the land was too hot to hold me till certain little things had blown over. There's that fellow Markham who ran against me one night. Then there's Cranky Jem. The first saw that I was still hanging about in London, and the other may have learnt by some means or another that I didn't die of the wound he gave me. Then again, there's those Zingarees whose money I walked off with one fine day. All these things made the land unsafe, and so I thought it best to embark the gold that I took from old King Zingaree in this barge, which was to be had so cheap." "I suppose we shall do better in time, Tony," said the Buffer. "When we get more acquainted with them light and heavy horsemen that we must employ, and them lumpers that gives the information." "Of course, when you set up in a new business, you can't expect to succeed directly," returned the Resurrection Man. "The regular pirates won't have confidence in us at first, and as yet we don't know a single captain or mate that will trust us with the job of robbing their ship. How do they know but what we would peach if we got into trouble and tell their employers that it was all done with their connivance? But old Mossop begins to grow more friendly, and that, I'm sure, is a good sign that he thinks that we shall succeed." "So it is," said the Buffer. "Besides, this barge is so good a blind that business must come. What should you say to getting into the skiff presently and taking a look out amongst the shipping for ourselves?" "Well, I've no objection," answered Tidkins, "but we've already a connection with several lumpers, and they have put us on to all that we have done up to the present time. Perhaps we should do better to wait for the information they can give us. They begin to see that we pay well, and so they'll only be too anxious to put things in our way." "True enough," observed the Buffer. At this period of the conveyance, a woman's head appeared above the cabin hatchway. "Supper's ready," she said. "We're coming, Moll," returned the Buffer. The 2 villains then descended into the cabin, where a well-spread table awaited them. Scarcely had the trio concluded their repast when a man who had come from the wharf and had walked across the barges until he reached the ferry called to Tidkins by the appellation of Captain from the hatchway. "Come below," answered the Resurrection Man. The person thus invited was the foreman in Mr. Mossop's employment. He was short, stout, and strongly built, with a tremendous rubicundity of visage, small piercing gray eyes, no whiskers, and a very apoplectic neck. His age might be about 50, and he was dressed in a light garb befitting the nature of his calling. "Well, Mr. Swat," said the Resurrection Man, as the little fat foreman descended the ladder, "this is really an unusual thing to have the honor of your company. Sit down, and you, Moll, put the lush and the pipes upon the table." "That's right, Captain," returned Mr. Swat as he seated himself. "I came on purpose to drink a social glass and have a chat with you. In fact, my present visit is not altogether without an object. I am glad of that, said the Resurrection Man. We want something to do. It was only just now that I and my mate were complaining how slack business was. You know that Mossop never has anything to do with any schemes in which chaps of your business choose to embark, continued Mr. Swat. He receives your goods and either keeps them in warehouse or carts them for you as you like, but he never knows where they come from. Well, Mr. Swat, said the Resurrection Man as the little foreman descended the ladder, this is really an unusual thing to have the honor of your company. Sit down, and you, Moll, put the lush and the pipes upon the table. That's right, Captain, returned Mr. Swat as he seated himself. I came on purpose to drink a social glass and have a chat with you. In fact, my present visit is not altogether without an object. I'm glad of that, said the Resurrection Man. We want something to do. It was only just now that I and my mate were complaining how slack business was. You know that Mossop never has anything to do with any schemes in which chaps of your business choose to embark, continued Mr. Swat. He receives your goods and either keeps them in warehouse or carts them for you as you like, but he never knows where they come from. Perfectly true, observed the Resurrection Man. But all that's no reason why I should be equally particular, proceeded Swat. Of course not, said the Resurrection Man. Well, then we're all friends here, asked Swat, glancing around him. All, replied Tidkins. This is my mate's wife. She answers to the name of Moll and is stanch to the backbone. Well and good, said Swat. Now I've as pretty a little idea in my head as ever was born there, but it requires 2 or 3 daring, I may say desperate fellers to carry it out. You couldn't come to a better shop for them kind of chaps, remarked the Buffer. And if it's necessary, I'll deuced soon dress myself up like a lighterman and help you, added Moll. I am very much pleased with your pluck, ma'am, said Mr. Swat, and I drink to your excellent health and our better acquaintance. Mr. Swat emptied his mug at a draught, lighted a pipe, and then continued thus. But now, my fine fellers, suppose I was to start some scheme which is about as dangerous as walking slap into a house on fire to get the iron safe that's full of gold and silver. Well, we're the men to do it, said Tidkins. That is, observed the Buffer, if so be the inducement is equal to the risk. Of course, returned Mr. Swat. Now, one more question. Would you sleep in the same room with a man who had the cholera or the smallpox, for instance, supposing you got £1,000 each to do it? I would in a minute, answered the Resurrection Man. Nothing dare, nothing have. So I say, added the Buffer, and you wouldn't find me flinch, cried Moll. Now then, we shall soon understand each other, resumed Swat, helping himself to another supply of grog. Please to listen to me for a few minutes. A very fine schooner, the Lady Anne of London, trades to the Gold Coasts of Guinea, and she takes out woolen, cotton, linen, arms, and gunpowder, which she exchanges for gold dust, ivory, guns, and hides. A few days since, as she was beating up the channel, homeward bound with a fine cargo, something occurs that make it necessary for her to run for the Medway instead of coming direct up to London. But the night before last it blew great guns, as you may recollect, and as she was but indifferently manned, she got out in her reckoning, for it was as dark as pitch, and ran ashore between the mouth of Medway and Gravesend. Now there she lies, and there she's likely to lie. She got stranded during spring tide, and she does not float now even at high water. The gold dust would be very acceptable. The guns, ivory, hides, and much like matters may stay where they are. Then the fact is the owners haven't yet moved out the cargo, said the Resurrection Man interrogatively. Leave it to me. I'll get 2 or 3 more hands, because we must be prepared to master all that we may meet on the deck of the schooner, the very moment we board it, so as not to give 'em time even to cry out, or they'd alarm the police boat. Well and good, said the Resurrection Man, but you don't mean to go into the lighter? No, we must have a good boat with 2 sculls, answered Swat. Leave that also to me. At daybreak everything shall be ready for you, and I shall join you in the evening at Gravesend. Agreed, cried Tidkins. Mr. Swat then took his departure, and the 3 persons whom he left behind in the lighter continued their carouse. In this way, the Resurrection Man, the Buffer, and Moll Wicks amused themselves until early 11 o'clock, when, just as they were thinking of retiring for the night, Tidkins to his bed in the after cabin, where they were seated, and the other 2 to their berth in the cuddy forward, the lighter was suddenly shaken from one end to the other by some heavy object which bumped violently against it. Okay, so we have caught up with the Resurrection Man. He is back together with the Buffer and Moll. They are pirates on the Thames, and they have just been given a dangerous but potentially lucrative job to do. So we'll see what they decide. See you in the next chapter.